Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I'm also the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race, and Rights. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights, also known as CSRR, engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and at RUCSRR. And if you find the Race and Rights Podcast informative, share it with your friends, rate us, and please consider making a tax-deductible donation by going to our website, csrr.rutgers.edu, and press the donate button. And please give generously. In today's episode, I am in conversation with Sheryll Cashin about opportunity hoarding and segregation in the age of inequality. Sheryll Cashin is Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law, Civil Rights, and Social Justice at Georgetown University Law Center. The iconic black hood, like slavery and Jim Crow, is a peculiar American institution animated by the ideology of white supremacy. Politicians and people of all colors propagated ghetto myths to justify racist policies that concentrated poverty in the hood and created high-opportunity white spaces. Professor Cashin traces the history of anti-black residential caste, boundary maintenance, opportunity hoarding, and stereotype-driven surveillance, and unpacks its current legacy so we can begin the work to dismantle the structures and policies that undermine Black lives. Drawing on nearly 2 decades of research in cities including Baltimore, St. Louis, Chicago, New York, and Cleveland, Professor Cashin traces the processes of residential caste as it relates to housing, policing, schools, and transportation. She contends that geography is now central to American caste. Poverty-free havens and poverty-dense hoods would not exist if the state had not designed, constructed, and maintained this physical racial order. Professor Cashin presents a comprehensive analysis of how government policy systematically created both impoverished Black neighborhoods and affluent white spaces, establishing what she terms as residential caste as the foundation of American inequality. Professor Cashin argues that these state-sanctioned systems affect all Americans and calls for their complete abolition, proposing instead an infrastructure of opportunity that would transform how society views and supports residents of marginalized communities. Let's hear what our guest has to say on a topic that shapes the lives of tens of millions of racial minorities across the United States.
I'm delighted to be here, honored to be part of CSSR's series. And I want to say my talk today is about my book because that's what I was invited to talk about. But the last thing I wrote was an MLK Day piece for Politico. And if you Google Sheryll Cashin Politico MLK Day 2024, it's about what I believe, were MLK still alive, would have to say about the terrible, inhumane attacks on Gazans. So I commend that to you. Dr. King, he gave a speech, an anti-Vietnam speech, and I basically say everything he said about Vietnamese villagers who are being bombed by the U.S., I think he would say about Gazans. Okay, so solidarity and love to you. I'm going to play a 4-minute film that gives you a very quick overview of this book that I think will make my talk go easier. So let's hope technology goes well. Here we go.
It's destroying opportunity. If high opportunity is sequestered only in certain places, neither cities nor struggling suburbs nor far out rural hamlets are an engine of opportunity in this country. We're not the land of opportunity in this system of residential caste. So I've been a professor at Georgetown Law for 25 years. And I've written a new book, White Space, Blackhood, Opportunity Hoarding and Segregation in the Age of Inequality. And in that book, I'm shining a light on American residential caste. So American residential caste is a system that was intentionally constructed to create affluent white spaces separated and apart from high poverty Black neighborhoods. We overinvest in and exclude in affluent white space, and we disinvest and prey upon the people trapped in the hood. So there are three anti-Black processes that undergird residential caste: boundary maintenance, opportunity hoarding, and stereotype-driven surveillance. Boundary maintenance is a polite word for segregation. The most persistent types of neighborhoods in large metropolitan or even medium metropolitan areas is affluent white space and high poverty minority neighborhoods, particularly Black neighborhoods. They have persisted, and the boundaries to those two types of neighborhoods have gotten harder. We're more segregated now than we were 20 years ago at these polar extremes. Opportunity hoarding is overinvesting in affluent majority white space and disinvesting elsewhere, particularly in Black neighborhoods. We tend to, use exclusionary zoning, neighborhood assignment, the boundaries of jurisdictions to hoard the opportunities there. Golden infrastructure in schools, wonderful transportation, job-rich social networks. Everyone else who's excluded from those high opportunity environments subsidizes that, right? Through taxation, through gasoline taxes. That gorgeous golden infrastructure is paid for and subsidized by the people who are excluded. And then the third is stereotype-driven surveillance by police and by private citizens. As with slavery and Jim Crow, a lot of non-Black citizens have been conscripted into policing-backed bodies. Stereotype-driven surveillance is driven by this idea that kind of behavior is deserved in majority Black neighborhoods. Police go through there with the lens, every young man is presumed a thug rather than a citizen. The beauty of, once you understand the processes, they actually provide the way forward. You basically abolish and reverse them. Inclusion rather than exclusion with boundary maintenance, giving historically defunded neighborhoods priority in investing rather than opportunity hoarding and disinvesting in Blackness. Humanization and care rather than stereotype-driven surveillance. A city that's gone through abolition repair, what I imagine and envision is that they will have returned to being engines of opportunity, particularly for poor people in poor neighborhoods. See them as assets and give them a chance to be an agent in their own liberation.
So how's that for optimism? Now, in case you're wondering, my husband and I are art collectors, and I was sitting in our great room, and I'm blessed to be surrounded by art. Okay, so I'm going to now share my PowerPoint slide, I think. Is this it? Okay, playing from the start. Okay, so enough about the book. You've heard enough about the book. Let me just say a little bit more. I'm going to walk you very, very quickly through this map of Buffalo. Gives you an instant picture of what I mean by residential caste. This is Buffalo. One dot is one person. You see Black people are rendered in green. 85% of Black people live east of Main Street in Buffalo. And there is only one supermarket in East Buffalo. And that because of this extreme hypersegregation, it made it easy for an avowed white supremacist to drive 200 miles from his majority white space to identify a one grocery store where it would be easy to spray down 10 Black people with bullets. It is an extreme example, but I show it to you because it would not be possible for millions of individuals just through their individual preferences and where to live to create this extreme degree of racial isolation. And there's no question that many groups in United States history have suffered forms of oppression, from conquest to colonization, exclusion, profiling. It just so happens that this system, residential caste, residential segregation, comes out of a very particular history of anti-Blackness. And that's what I'm talking about today. But I want to underscore that everybody has to live with the advantages and disadvantages of residential caste. For those of you who are watching this from New Jersey, this map is of the Newark area, the Newark metropolitan area, and yellow is Black or African Americans. And you see this density of Blackness again was constructed. Each time this country seemed to have put to bed a peculiar Black subordinating institution, it created another one, from slavery to Jim Crow to the iconic Black ghetto. And the rhetoric and mythology and the stereotypes that were part of the politics of creating and supporting these institutions metastasize over time. And I want to underscore, most countries, we have Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, most countries have hierarchies and systems of caste. Ours happens to come out of, and they have an origin mythology supporting it. Ours happens to come out of a long history of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Now, residential caste really arises from the Great Migration. The dominant response to more than 6 million Black people moving between 1910 and 1970 to escape violence-backed Jim Crow to seek opportunity elsewhere in the North, Midwest, and West. The primary response was to contain them in neighborhoods, intensely compact neighborhoods, and to segregate and redline those neighborhoods, to cut them off from the public largesse that was rained down on majority white neighborhoods and exclude them from those neighborhoods and benefits. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the history of redlining. Has been covered in many books. Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. I cover it in Black Space, White, and White Space, Black Hood. This is the Newark area. There was a color code, green being grade A, red being grade D. Most majority Black neighborhoods were marked in red, marked with a D, literally called hazardous. And there's a fed, and if any city you're interested in, if you just Google redlining and the name of the city, the old redlining map will pop up and articles will pop up telling the story of redlining and disinvestment in majority Black and brown, the most politically marginal neighborhoods. And what's sad is that, a recent Fed study found that you can go to all of the neighborhoods that were marked with a D in red, and with rare exception, most of those neighborhoods still experience a disinvestment, which began almost immediately, a disinvestment and decline. There's a causal connection decades on. All right, this is more showing of Newark. And it wasn't just redlining. Most of the signature policies of the 20th century that shaped what cities look like and what suburbs look like had an anti-Black element, right? From redlining to single family exclusionary zoning to urban renewal, mowing down strategically located Black neighborhoods and displacing people who live there often into public housing assigned on a segregated basis. What happens when you have a policy where 100% of a high-rise public housing is going to be Black and poor? Overnight, you create a density of Black poverty that didn't exist before. And then discriminatory highway construction, where highways were laid intentionally to separate the so-called good and bad sides of town. And stereotypes, there was an iterative relationship. A stereotype would be part of the politics to support an anti-Black systemic law. And those laws, once they created the systems, private individuals that benefited from those systems of exclusion would get inculcated into participating in the politics of maintaining those boundaries. And we've just had an uninterrupted vicious circle like that. And so, here we have an example from the Philly Camden area. Now, we had a hyper segregation of Black people in the mid 20th century. The good news is that Black-white segregation has been coming down slowly over time, although the vast majority of Black people still experience segregation. It's just not quite as extreme. But the footprint of concentrated poverty of all colors has exploded since in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, and you see that here. I don't know what it's like to live in a neighborhood where 80 to 100% of the people around you are poor, but you see the footprint of concentrated poverty has exploded in and around the central city of Philadelphia, and then right here, what we're seeing with the gentrification of downtowns is the whitening of strategic areas and becoming more affluent and more white. And this is what residential caste looks like now. And a key point, if you remember nothing else I've said today, but if you remember nothing else I said today, I want you to understand the linkage between the same policies that encourage and construct affluent majority white space also concentrate Black and brown poverty elsewhere. These two ideas are linked. And in many ways, society is increasingly designed for the affluent people that can afford to buy their way into poverty-free Black space. Poverty-free majority white space. And everybody else who can't afford to buy their way in, which often costs like 7 figures, gets a very different deal and is cross-subsidizing through their tax dollars the affluent majority white bubbles. As I said in the film, we tend to overinvest and exclude in affluent space and disinvest and prey on people in areas of concentrated poverty. And what I was showing is that I've given you the history that constructed these boundaries, but I really try to underscore in my book is that the past is not past. We have 3 current, ongoing anti-Black policies. And when I say anti-Black, is that it's been shown that the more segregated metropolitan areas, they tend to show higher degrees of anti-Black prejudice in polling. That coupled with exclusionary zoning, many metropolitan cities are zoned such that it's illegal to build anything other than a single family house on as much as 75% of the land, right? That policy is born of anti-Blackness, but every millennial, every color that can't afford a single family house lives with that burden. And increasingly, American households are not 2 parents with children. They're very different. And the market is not building the kind of housing that all kinds of people need because of this system. Opportunity hoarding. So this kind of concentrated poverty, this is hyper-segregated Baltimore. At one point, we had more than 50 cities that were hyper-segregated. Now we're down to about 21. That said, and African Americans are the only racial group in the 20th century that suffered this degree of extreme residential isolation. But it's a good news that we're down to 21 hyper-segregated cities, and Philly Camden is one of them, one of the areas, as is Baltimore, as is Buffalo. But still, we have very high degrees of segregation. And as Douglas Massey says in a very important book called Categorically Unequal, the social distinctions that come naturally to people become much more efficient when they're overlaid with geography. It's much easier to other somebody when you live apart from them and it's those people over there. And when you have decades of disinvestment in majority Black and brown neighborhoods, what people tend to do is associate what those neighborhoods look like with the individuals there. And so we have a rhetoric and a mythology, I call it ghetto mythology, where we pathologize. I lovingly call the people trapped in high poverty neighborhoods descendants. They are the true descendants of African-American slavery, right? We pathologize them, and that mythology, welfare queen, thug, actually helps mask decades of overinvestment in affluent white space and disinvestment there. And I'll tell you, this segregation alters race relations in this way, and particularly creates fear of Black people in large numbers. But it also alters politics such that you have a direct horizontal competition between communities of abundance and great political influence with communities of great need for limited public and private resources, and over again, affluent places win. Even in a majority Black run city where Blacks have majority representation on the city council in Baltimore and have had a series of Black mayors, one scholar looked at the numbers and discovered that Baltimore was spending 4 times as much money for community development and the things that make communities nice in majority white areas than Black areas, to their own horror. And now they're trying to disrupt those practices. In the chapter 1 of the book, I feature Baltimore as a case study, and I particularly focus on a notorious example of opportunity hoarding. Since 1965, there had been a plan on the books to build a light rail line, a subway line that would connect the poorest Black neighborhoods of East and West Baltimore to suburban job centers and to downtown. And thanks to a START grant, a $900 million START grant from the Obama administration, and frankly, their Black Secretary of Transportation, that plus a politics, a democratic multiracial politics that finally supported allocating state funds for this, it was finally going to get built, and, you know, a $2 billion project. And what happened? A Republican, Larry Hogan, got elected, and immediately, and it was right after the uprising surrounding Freddie Gray's death, he rescinded the deal and reallocated 100% of the funds that Maryland had allocated to get started on the Red Line, returned the $900 million grant, and reallocated 100% of those funds to road projects in outlying majority white areas. Not even a pothole in Baltimore was filled, right? But he allowed the Purple Line that was going to connect the affluent suburb Baltimore, the affluent Maryland suburbs to the DC metro, right? And he called the Red Line a wasteful boondoggle, despite the fact that all of the people along this line were very dependent on public transportation, and it could take 2 hours to get there, right? So this is opportunity hoarding and the devaluing of the infrastructure and community development needs of Black and brown citizens. It's pretty repugnant. All right. A contrast, Medellin, Colombia. Medellin transformed itself over 2 decades from being one of the most dangerous cities on earth to a beacon of innovation. How did they do it? They prioritized investment in the poorest communities. Planners intentionally connected metro cable cars to the most crime-ridden mountaintop barrios, cutting the commute times from 2.5 hours to 30 minutes, where you could get downtown. Surprise, surprise, homicides in those neighborhoods dropped significantly, and the poverty rate in those neighborhoods dropped by almost half, just from that innovation. But they also went further, and this is an example, I think, of that gives you a sense of what abolition democracy looks like. I'll define that in a minute. But they also invested in new social institutions, created something I'd never heard of, a library park, right? Library parks located in the poorest neighborhoods where you had a library, but parks and recreation too, where citizens and kids had access to the type of amenities that are very common in affluent private schools, libraries, sports and recreation, computer and internet access, opportunities to produce theater and stage, things that raise self-esteem. They created new citizen centers in the same impoverished hoods that enabled people to access all of the social services and literacy programs. And these neighborhoods were reclaimed from narco guerrillas and became engines of opportunities rather than engines of death. And the entire city benefited, the entire economy. And now people visit Medellin from around the world to try to replicate this. So here's my point. These are just maps showing that back in the U.S., we still have this pattern of majority white space and concentrated poverty, in part because of intentional strategies about where low-income housing and public housing gets located. This is Houston. This is another map similar to the map I showed you of Philly and Camden. Look how much red is very low income, blue is very high income. Look how much Chicago has just become a city of concentrated wealth and concentrated poverty. There's, the middle class has basically been pushed out of the city. But what happens? The majority white affluent space gets 3 times the public and private investment of vast swaths of poor neighborhoods. They get waves of school closures and disinvestment. All right. So the beauty, as I said in the film, and I'm closing now, is that once you understand these processes and see how damaging they are to the whole, it frees you up to try something different. And the first step, my final chapter is called Abolition and Repair. I argue we abolish slavery. I argue that we need to abolish residential caste. The first step to abolition and repair is altering the lens, just like in the Medellin example, changing the lens that we apply to poor people in concentrated poverty, from presumed thug to presumed citizen. And once you change, if you apply a lens of care and see these folks as assets, it frees you up to focus on evidence-based strategies that actually have been shown to produce better results, right? It alters the politics and creates possibilities for a new multiracial politics that invests in things that can make lives better, right? And so I'll leave you with some hope that cities like Newark, and I can give you examples, have actually been trying things based on this lens of care, where they've reduced violence through social experience, like universal basic income or deconcentrating poverty. Some cities have made their bus routes from the poorest neighborhoods free. Some cities have been reversing or repealing their single family zoning code. And I'll end with this point, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, in his masterful book, Black Reconstruction, talked about how we need abolition democracy, that Black Americans will never be accorded the same economic, political, social freedom as whites without a reconstructed society with new institutions, practices, and social relations. And I think the Medellin example shows that. I think our best chance of that kind of coalition politics that makes things better for everyone is in progressive cities, particularly progressive cities that have at least a cooperative state government and not a hostile one.
Thank you so much, Professor Cashin. So much to think about. I read your book a year ago and thought to myself, the more things change, the more things stay the same. They just take different forms. And I think that is one of the lessons that perhaps many of us as professors try to warn our students is you read about these systems and structures of inequality 50, 60, 70 years ago, and you'd like to think that it's over. But in fact, it's just been reshaped and repackaged and given a different name and gone from de jure to de facto. I thought I'd take the moderator's prerogative to ask you a few questions. And you kind of ended with one of the questions that I'm sure many people, when they hear your presentation, it prompts them to think, which is this overlap or this intersection between race and class. And that often also triggers various conversations and sometimes contentious ones about, do you focus more on classism or do you focus more on racism, or how do you address them intersectionally when you are trying to create a more equitable society, especially along racial lines? In your research, how does someone, whether it's a lawyer, a law student, or a policymaker, whose objective is to ensure that our society, the race you're born with does not determine the class and your economic opportunities, your educational opportunities, or in your life, right? So how you are born is not how you will die, especially in terms of class, but how that then is impacted by race. And how do you kind of wrestle with that? And how do you approach this race-class conversation, whether it's through an intersectional or separated approach? But you can't, obviously, just everything you just explained to us in the contemporary era is all about low income, right? And the question is, why are all the low income?
Let me answer the question, Professor.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. In post-civil rights America, I think we need a more complicated way of thinking about this. Okay. So I took 200 pages to explain to people that we have a caste system that's at the intersection of where you live, your socioeconomic status, and your race, right? Race alone is not, yes, my kids, my husband and I, me and my husband have 3 degrees between us and we're doing economically quite well. But yes, my husband can possibly be profiled if he goes in a store or people cross the street when they see him, right? But we have access to opportunity and we have the wherewithal, at least to negotiate the anti-discrimination laws if, a praiser comes in. I mean, we know, take down your Black pictures, take down your Black art, and we can at least protect ourselves against that kind of stuff, right? But people who are in the most marginal neighborhoods are so othered, and often they're othered by people of their own race, right? So I offered a different vocabulary for thinking about this. And people always want to just go right back to what I'm saying is we need to disrupt these practices, particularly practices of boundary maintenance. And I argue that when it comes to spending, public spending, that we ought to prioritize and put the people who are at the bottom of this caste system first in line, right? DC is just doing this, right? People from the most marginal neighborhoods get priority in the school lottery for access to the charter schools, which are all over the city, right? People who are in the most marginal neighborhoods should get to ride the metro for free, right? We need to help them access opportunity, right? Their neighborhood should be first in line for parks and recreation because they've been, I almost use the vulgarity, but they've been so disinvested in, right? So I guess because of 2 decades of obsession with this, I've been thinking about place and where you live. And it's also a way of creating some solidarity. Concentrated poverty is growing fastest in the suburbs. Some of these older first string suburbs that used to be the Levitt towns of opportunity now are just like overrun by poverty, right? And people of a lot of different colors are stuck in these communities. So I'm not saying race and class don't matter, but what I'm trying to get people to think about is systems, right? With race and class, people tend to revert to the anti-discrimination model and how you protect individuals. I'm trying to get people to think about systems and policies that systemically box a lot of people out. I hope that's helpful.
No, that's very helpful. And it sounds like the key players are the mayors and the urban planners and cities, and maybe to a lesser extent, but equally important, our state legislators. Because, one of the challenges, as somebody who doesn't study local and state law and politics, it's always you're trying to figure out who's your target audience that has the most influence. And one of the things you mentioned, which I thought was telling, and I certainly have been thinking about it quite a bit because of the case of Baltimore and Newark and DC, is what is your advice, if we were to say in the abstract, right, to mayors who are Black and who have large areas of concentrated poverty that also happen to be primarily Black neighborhoods? And
that's the case in all three of the cities you mentioned, isn't it?
Right, exactly. And so for those who have not yet had a chance to read your book, and hopefully this will prompt them to do this talk, is what is the type of advice that you give them or policy recommendations you give them that you find to be the most impactful in terms of the types of changes?
Okay, well, more than 24 mayors of all colors have adopted or are trying to adopt universal basic income pilots, where they can't afford to do it for everyone, but they're trying this, where they, surprise, you give a impoverished family $500 a month unconditional. They spend it on the things that really help their children, and they do so much better. The children do better. They don't end up in the criminal justice system. So there's an example. So UBI experience for communities, and DC is definitely, fortunately, nationally, the violent crime is going down, but not in DC. We just had a shooting right on the corner, a block and a half from my house on Thursday night, right? This is really real in this city. I think prioritizing violence reduction in innovative ways should be a number one priority of every mayor, right? Violence, it affects everybody, right? And I give this example, it's just innovation of the first city that got going on this, Richmond. Richmond had one of the worst homicide rates per capita in the country, Richmond, California. And this person who looked at it was basically only 24 young people, the 24 young people who were most likely to pull the trigger with a lens of care. He could see himself in them. And they came up with this innovation. They knew exactly who they were, went to them and said, what do you need to turn your life around? Do you need to get out of this neighborhood? Do you need a driver's license? Do you need cognitive behavior therapy? They just wrapped them in unconditional love, and got $1 million grant, seed money from the city, but also from philanthropists, and created urban peacemaker fellowships, where if they developed a life plan, they had 24/7 a life plan for each of them to turn their lives around. And if they stuck with it for 9 months, they started paying them $1,000 a month stipend just to be nonviolent. And the people who were most expert on violence in that city were the people most likely to pull the trigger. And they saw them as an asset. They know more than anybody what's causing the violence and how to turn it around. So when the people most likely to shoot started changing their lives, it had multiplier effects. Violence went down in that city by more than 50%. And then, of course, the city starts gentrifying, so people start moving in, right? But I would encourage every mayor who's got violent neighborhoods and a lot of large urban cities to just look at these models or how we can create a transcending scenario with some serious results quickly. So in terms of infrastructure, in terms of anti-violence, in terms of individual support, I'm a big fan of UBIs. I'm a big fan of the model of Medellin. Transportation, it could take decades to change residential patterns, but transportations connect people to opportunity immediately, right? Make bus routes free for people from the poorest neighborhoods. You could figure out the multiplier effects of helping people get jobs and start paying taxes are tremendous. I hope this is helpful.
Yeah. And sadly, it is often these wealthy neighborhoods who, again, are predominantly white that don't want the public transportation because they don't want the minorities or the low income communities of whatever race to have physical access to their spaces. So, myself from personal experience in the town that I live in Westfield, New Jersey, it's just remarkable how this aversion to poverty and racial minorities is so palpable, even if it's not explicitly spoken. And you feel like you're back in the 1950s.
Right. And so, we need to have some successes to turn this around. If you can get violence down, it helps a lot. Violence is a big thing that animates fear. But the thing that gives me hope, each new cohort of young people in this country is more diverse than the one that preceded it. And I think the younger you are, the more openness you have to entering very diverse, economically and racially very diverse space, particularly if it's more affordable, right? And so I think it's easier to create a multiracial democracy in which inclusion is valued with new generations of younger people. And I give the example of Louisville, Kentucky, which went from hyper segregated to just segregated, and has a real culture of people valuing public schools and integrated public schools. They have a voluntary integration system that's based on neighborhoods and where you live, not race, because the Supreme Court won't let you consider race. But when they decoupled access to really good schools from where you live, you could take the risk of buying a cheaper home in a more poor or marginal neighborhood, and younger people, younger whites who can't afford these and don't want these big suburban mansions started buying, and buying that model. And so that over 2 decades, the housing market became less segregated, and it's not hyper segregated. I don't know that I can expect older people to change their ways.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.